See, in patients of tension pneumothorax, there is formation of one-way air valve. So it's one-way valve leak. Because of that, the air is forced into thoracic cavity. And when air is collected under tension, first it is going to compress the ipsilateral lung. Hi guys, hope you are safe and healthy. This is Dr. Pritesh Singh, Surgery Faculty with Prepladder and author of AIMS Essence, NEAT Essence, Surgery Essence, INI CT Essence and Quick Review of Surgery. These are my best-selling titles. So we are going to discuss the surgery questions of NEAT PG 2021. So let's start. See the first question. A 55 years old woman underwent modified radical mastectomy 3 months back for breast cancer, which was located in upper outer quadrant of left breast. Now she developed painless swelling in the left upper limb, whose image is given below. What is the most probable cause? So in this image you can see that this patient developed what? Lymphedema in the left upper limb following breast cancer surgery. Most probably modified radical mastectomy was done, in which axillary lymph node dissection was done, and because of that patient developed lymphedema. This lymphedema can occur sometimes within months and sometimes even after years of surgery, means axillary lymph node dissection. So what is the correct answer here? It is lymphedema. You know, rest of these three conditions, lymphangiosarcoma, also known as angiosarcoma, axillary vein thrombosis and cellulitis, all these are painful conditions. These are painful. Only lymphedema, it's painless, right? And here you can notice in the question it is mentioned. So in the question you have seen that after modified radical mastectomy, in which we have to perform the removal of level 1 and level 2 lymph node, so axillary lymph node dissection was done and patient developed painless swelling in left upper limb. So the diagnosis is lymphedema. It is a painless condition. Now see the literature, what is written in Bailey related to lymphedema of arm after mastectomy. So it's a complication of breast cancer treatment, and generally it can appear any time from months to years after treatment. Sometimes what happens, patient is going to develop lymphedema because of neoplastic infiltration, and if there is neoplastic infiltration, because of that there is edema in the limb. That is the painful condition. So because of neoplastic infiltration, if it's occurring, it's painful. Another important point, after 10.5 years, what's the duration? After 10.5 years of modified radical mastectomy and radiotherapy, these patients are going to develop angiosarcoma, and this is known as Stewart-Treves syndrome. So this is known as Stewart-Treves syndrome. Okay, if you see the question again, rest three are painful condition, only lymphedema is painless condition. So correct answer for this question is A. Now see the second question. After total thyroidectomy under general anesthesia, anesthetist tried to extubate the patient, but he was unable to extubate. What is the most probable reason? So two things you have to understand, that in this case we are performing total thyroidectomy. After that patient was not being extubated. Anesthetist was not able to extubate. So what's the cause? Generally in these patients during thyroidectomy, there is bilateral recurrent laryngeal nerve injury. And because of this bilateral recurrent laryngeal nerve injury, what happens? The vocal cord position is in the midline. Because of that, there is airway compromise. And that's why patient is not being extubated. You know, this is an emergency situation, and in such cases we have to perform what? Tracheostomy, which can be either temporary or permanent, right? So what is the cause here? It's because of bilateral recurrent laryngeal nerve injury. Why? Because in this case the vocal cord comes in the midline, position is in the midline, and because of that, what's the problem? There is airway compromise. Airway compromise. Okay. There is another condition in which there can be respiratory distress, and in which case there is respiratory distress if patient is going to develop tension hematoma, and in which case patient is going to develop tension hematoma. And when it is going to occur, tension hematoma is not going to occur in intraoperative period. Generally, it occurs in post-operative period, right? So obviously it is ruled out. It is not going to occur in intraoperative period, and you know, in thyroidectomy we place the drain also. So usually it is not going to occur during intraoperative period. Another important point, that what are the nerves injured during thyroidectomy? You know that superior thyroid vessels are ligated close to thyroid to prevent the injury of external branch of superior laryngeal nerve. And what is the most commonly injured nerve during thyroidectomy? It's not recurrent laryngeal nerve. It's the superior laryngeal nerve. Which branch? External branch. So most commonly injured nerve is external branch of superior laryngeal nerve. Because of injury of the superior laryngeal nerve, there is loss of tension of vocal cord. And if there is loss of tension of vocal cord, so what happens? The quality of voice is diminished. It's poor. So what happens? There is decreased tension or loss of tension of vocal cord, and because of that there is diminished power and range of voice. Clear? Second situation. This is third. If patient is having only unilateral recurrent laryngeal nerve damage. So in this case what happens? The ipsilateral vocal fold is affected or vocal cord is affected, right? And in these patients there is hoarseness of voice or poor quality of voice, and these patients have increased risk of aspiration. But because of unilateral recurrent laryngeal nerve injury, what? It's difficult that patient is having airway compromise. So these are ruled out. These two are ruled out. Hemorrhage cannot cause airway compromise during intraoperative period. So correct answer for this question is B, and that is bilateral recurrent laryngeal nerve injury. See the important points which is written to nerve injury during thyroidectomy in subiston. So unilateral recurrent laryngeal nerve injury and resultant vocal cord paralysis can cause spectrum of problems, and generally there is a problem with voice or sometimes with swallowing. So what are those symptoms? Symptoms are hoarseness and breathy voice. There is vocal fatigue. These patients can have dysphagia and aspiration. Incidence of bilateral recurrent laryngeal nerve injury, it's rare, and if it's there, what happens? There is vocal cord position in the midline, and because of that there can be airway compromise, and if there is airway compromise we need tracheostomy. See the third question. All of the following statements are true about management of pheochromocytoma patient except. Okay, so first, propranolol is the initial drug to be started? No. You know that the drug of choice is phenoxybenzamine. So initial drug to be started, it's alpha blocker. And what's the name? It's phenoxybenzamine, not the beta blocker of propranolol. Surgery is the treatment of choice. Yes, since most of the pheochromocytomas are benign, we have to perform the adrenalectomy. Which surgery? Generally we go for laparoscopic adrenalectomy. So what kind of surgery? We do laparoscopic adrenalectomy. In majority of cases, tumor is benign. VMA and catecholamines are the diagnostic test. This is correct. So B and C options are correct. Which one is false or incorrect? It's A. So correct answer for this question, it's A. The initial drug to be started, it's phenoxybenzamine or alpha blocker, not the beta blocker. See the screenshots from Surgery Sense. So most sensitive screening test for pheochromocytoma is urinary catecholamines and VMA level. VMA is vanillyl mandelic acid. And what is the best test for diagnosis? That is fractionated plasma metanephrines. Now coming to the management. So we discussed that the treatment of choice is what? Adrenalectomy. And if the tumor size is less than 5 cm, we go for laparoscopic adrenalectomy. Drug of choice, that is phenoxybenzamine. which is an alpha blocker, you should not give beta blockers first. Whenever we give beta blockers, after starting alpha blockers, when there is full alpha blockade, so if the patient is fully alpha blocked and patient develops tachycardia, then only we start beta blockers. If you start beta blockers first, what will happen? There will be hypertensive crisis. There will be hypertensive crisis because of unopposed alpha stimulation. So if you see the question again, what is the correct answer for this question? Propranolol is the initial drug to be started. This is the correct answer because it's incorrect option. See the question number 4. A 50 years old male patient presented to the hospital with colicky abdominal pain. So there is colicky abdominal pain and bilious vomiting, right? It means colicky pain, bilious vomiting means patient is having obstruction. Okay, now see the question. On evaluation, air was present in the CBD. So if there is presence of air in the CBD, it means there is pneumobilia. Pneumobilia. So what are the findings? The patient is having small bowel obstruction. Since the patient is having colicky pain and multiple episodes of vomiting, and this patient is having pneumobilia, right? So what is the diagnosis? See, most common cause of small bowel obstruction is adhesions. But in adhesions, what's the problem? There is no pneumobilia. Even in gastroenteritis, outlet obstruction, what? Pneumobilia is not there. So pneumobilia is seen whenever there is communication between biliary tract and gastrointestinal tract. It means there is some fistula, and what's that fistula? It's cholecystoduodenal fistula, and this fistula is formed in the patients who are having gallstone ileus. So what is the correct answer? It's gallstone ileus. And you know, there is plain X-ray triad. What? Plain X-ray triad, in which there is small bowel obstruction, there is pneumobilia, and there is ectopic gallstones. What? Ectopic gallstones. And this plain X-ray triad is known as what? Rigler's triad. It's Rigler's triad. And you know that this Rigler's triad is diagnostic of what? Gallstone ileus. So what's the correct answer for this question? It's D. See, the problem in gallstone ileus, generally these patients are having single large stone in the gallbladder. It is going to erode the wall of gallbladder, and after that what happens? There is formation of a fistula between gallbladder and duodenum, that is cholecystoduodenal fistula. It is cholecystoduodenal fistula. This is the most common site of fistula, right? After that, stone goes into the duodenum and it is going to obstruct the narrowest part of small bowel, that's terminal ileum. So this is the terminal ileum, which is the site of obstruction. And obviously if the patient will be having small bowel obstruction, we have to relieve the obstruction. So how? We perform exploratory laparotomy, we milk the stone proximally, perform enterotomy, remove the stone. Majority of these patients are elderly, right? So that's why in majority of these patients we just go for enterotomy and removal of stone. If in the question it is mentioned that patient is young and stable, in that case we can go for cholecystectomy. Otherwise the treatment of choice is only enterotomy and removal of stone. If you see the literature, what Bailey says that the characteristic radiological sign of gallstone ileus is Rigler's triad, and this is what? Plain X-ray triad of small bowel obstruction, pneumobilia, and ectopic gallstone, means atypical mineral shadow on radiograph of the abdomen. So correct answer for this question is D, that is gallstone ileus. See the question number 5. A 45 years old female patient presented to the hospital with obstructive jaundice. So first finding that the patient is having obstructive jaundice, and what's the cause of obstructive jaundice? CBD stone. Patient has the history of cholecystectomy done 2 years back. So what happened? Within 2 years of cholecystectomy, CBD stone was detected in the patient. Within 2 years. So what is this type of stone? See, there are two definitions. of CBD stone. One is primary, one is secondary. What is primary CBD stone? If the stone is formed in the CBD. So whenever the stone is formed in the CBD, it is primary. And whenever the stone is formed into the gallbladder and after that it migrates into CBD, this is secondary. Second definition, there is retained stone and recurrent stone. Retained means it is detected within 2 years of cholecystectomy, and recurrent when it's detected after 2 years, right? So see, within 2 years, it means most probably it's a secondary stone. And which type of? Obviously, it's a retained stone. So two options are correct. You can mark it secondary or retained. But if you see the definition, detected within 2 years, so that is retained CBD stone. See the screenshots from Surgery Sense, and these definitions are clearly mentioned. We discussed these definitions so many times in the video lectures also. Retained stones discovered within 2 years, recurrent stones detected after 2 years of cholecystectomy. And what's the definition of primary and secondary CBD stone? We discussed. In primary CBD stone, generally stones are going to develop within CBD because of stasis and infection. Sometimes the worms are also responsible. And what kind of stone? That's brown stone. Secondary CBD stones, these are formed in gallbladder, then slips into CBD. These are cholesterol stones, right? So if you see the question, it's retained stone. And suppose in the question it is mentioned that the stone was detected after 2 years of cholecystectomy. So if it's more than 2 years, in that case, what's the correct answer? It's recurrent. So the language of the question says that the correct answer for this question is C, that's the retained CBD stone. See the literature also, what is mentioned in substance related to retained CBD stone or biliary stones. Retained stones, also known as secondary stones, generally identified for up to 2 years after cholecystectomy. See the question number 6. A 40 years old male patient presented to emergency with acute abdominal pain. So the patient is having acute abdominal pain and the patient is having distension. Second statement says fluid filled lesion is present in the epigastric region. So what's the problem? This patient is having pain, there is distension, and after that you notice that this patient developed a fluid filled lesion where? In the epigastrium. So what is the classical picture? This is the classical picture of acute pancreatitis in which patient developed acute pancreatic fluid collection. Acute pancreatic fluid collection. And you know, after acute pancreatitis, there is injury to pancreas. So whenever there is localized fluid collection, it is rich in enzymes. Localized collections are rich in enzymes. Simultaneously, enzymes are released into the serum. That's why you must be knowing that in patients of acute pancreatitis, we are going to assess what? Serum amylase and what? Serum lipase. Serum amylase and serum lipase, because these enzymes are released into the serum. Second, there is localized collection. Collection is rich into these enzymes. So what is the correct answer? Patient is having acute pancreatitis. Which of the following parameters will be raised? Bilirubin? No. GGT, gamma glutamyl transpeptidase? C. GGT, ALP 5-nucleotidase. These are the markers of cholestasis. Lipase, yes, it is raised. CEA, generally it's a tumor marker raised in malignancy or some pre-malignant conditions which are going to increase the risk of adenocarcinoma, right? So correct answer for this question is C, that's lipase. Now see, in diagnosis we are going to assess serum amylase, serum lipase. You know that amylase can be raised in non-pancreatic conditions also. That's why which one is more specific? The more specific than serum amylase is serum lipase. See the literature, what Blumgard says, which is the Bible of hepatobiliary pancreatic tract surgery, that Acute fluid collections associated with acute pancreatitis are enzyme-rich collections which are having amylase lipase. And second, in patients of acute pancreatitis, what happens? There is release of these enzymes into the serum, and that's why we can assess what? Serum amylase and serum lipase. And if you see, serum lipase is more sensitive and specific. So for this particular question, what is the correct answer? It is C, and that's lipase. See the question number 7. A 60 years old male patient presented to the hospital with gastric outlet obstruction. So there is gastric outlet obstruction. On evaluation, there was antral gastric carcinoma extending to head of pancreas and multiple metastases to right lobe of liver. What is the most appropriate management? So you can see here, this is the stomach, this is the duodenum, this is the liver, gallbladder, bile duct, and this is the pancreas. Right? Problem, the patient is having where is malignancy at the antrum, and because of this malignancy there is gastric outlet obstruction also. There is involvement of head of pancreas, and in the right lobe there are multiple metastases. It means this carcinoma stomach is unresectable with multiple metastases. There is emergency situation of gastric outlet obstruction, so we have to go for the palliation. And how we are going for palliation? We perform palliative gastrojejunostomy to relieve this obstruction. Tumor is unresectable, so obviously we are not going to resect it. We perform palliative gastrojejunostomy. To prolong survival, we give chemotherapy also. Why chemotherapy? To prolong the survival. You know, if the patient is having metastatic carcinoma stomach, on an average, how much is the survival? Hardly 3 to 6 months. That's why we will not go for any kind of radical surgery or radical procedure. So, options. What is the most appropriate management? Right lobe hepatectomy with radical gastrectomy? Obviously not. Whipple's procedure? No. This is for malignancies arising from head of pancreas or second part of duodenum. It's a radical procedure. It should not be done. Palliative gastrojejunostomy with chemotherapy. This is correct. And radical gastrectomy with chemotherapy, we should not go for radical gastrectomy. So correct answer for this question is C. See the literature, what's written in Bailey, carcinoma stomach. Patient suffering from significant symptoms of obstruction or bleeding. What kind of resection is appropriate? Palliative resection. And what's written in Subiston, if the patient is having unresectable or metastatic gastric tumor or cancer, hardly 3 to 5 months survival. That's why in such patients, we should go for palliative surgical therapy. Which type of? If the patient is having gastric outlet obstruction, obstructing gastric cancer, so the most common procedure performed in this particular setting, it's gastrojejunostomy. Can we give chemotherapy? Yes. Systemic chemotherapy, prolonged survival. Sometimes it is going to shrink the obstructive tumor. So correct answer is palliative gastrojejunostomy with chemotherapy in the patient who is having unresectable carcinoma stomach with gastric outlet obstruction. See the question number 8. Easy question, and almost every year in one or more exams you are going to find this question. 18 months old, age 18 months, male child. Two important properties. Brought to the hospital with multiple episodes of vomiting. What kind of? Non-bilious vomiting, and there is poor feeding. Child was passing dry pellets like stool. Which of the following findings will be seen? So if you see the patient profile, 18 months old, male child, multiple episodes of non-bilious vomiting, poor feeding, so all of these finding goes in the favor of infantile hypertrophic pyloric stenosis. What's the problem in infantile hypertrophic pyloric stenosis? In such patients, you will notice that there is hypertrophy at pylorus, hypertrophy of circular muscle fibers at pylorus, and because of that there is obstruction. So what kind of dyselectrolytemia will be seen if patient is having multiple episodes of non-bilious vomiting? Very easy to understand. You know, in stomach there is HCl, and in stomach there is mucus. Because of that, there is potassium. So whenever there will be loss of these electrolytes in the vomiting, what will happen? There is hypokalemia. Yes, potassium is being lost, hypokalemia. Chloride, so there is hypochloremia, hypochloremia, and there is loss of H plus. So this patient will be having what? Metabolic alkalosis. There is metabolic alkalosis. Simple. This is seen in the beginning. What happens later? Whenever the patient is having metabolic alkalosis, in collecting duct of kidney, there is sodium proton exchanger. What happens? Sodium proton exchanger. So since there is loss of H plus in the vomitus, kidney is going to preserve H plus and kidney is going to excrete sodium. When sodium is being excreted into the urine, water also goes with sodium. So what happens? There is loss of sodium, loss of water. So body goes into the state of hypovolemia and hyponatremia. The moment kidney is going to sense this, what happens? This function is reversed. So now kidney starts excreting H plus and start absorbing sodium. So what happens? There is hypokalemia, hypochloremia, metabolic alkalosis, and what? Paradoxical aciduria. There is paradoxical aciduria. This paradoxical aciduria is not seen in all cases. It is only seen in severe cases when patient is having hyponatremia and hypovolemia. Clear? So the classical dyselectrolytemia seen in patients of hypertrophic pyloric stenosis is hypokalemia, hypochloremia, metabolic alkalosis with paradoxical aciduria. So if you see the options, hypochloremic, hypokalemic, metabolic alkalosis, this is correct. There is no acidosis. Hyperkalemia, so there is no hyperkalemia. Correct answer for this question is A. See the question number 9. Patient presented to the emergency with pain abdomen. So there is pain, there is fever for 3 days and dehydrated face. Why there is dehydrated face? Obviously this patient is having what? Hypovolemia. Clear? Abdominal X-ray images are shown below. What's the most probable diagnosis? So in the question, both erect film and supine film was provided. Both films were given in the question. If you see this erect film, in the erect film, you can see there is free air under the right dome of diaphragm. And what you can see, apart from that, multiple air fluid levels. If you see the supine film, in that supine film, you can see multiple dilated bowel loops. See the bigger picture. So in this bigger picture, you can see that this is the free air under right dome of diaphragm. So obviously this patient is having pneumoperitoneum and this patient is having multiple air fluid levels, right? And if you see the supine film, here you can see dilated bowel loops. So initially there will be obstruction, later there is perforation. So obviously this patient is having perforation peritonitis. So what's the correct answer? It's not liver abscess, it's not gastric volvulus empyema thoracis. The correct answer is hollow viscous perforation. So correct answer for this question is D. See the question number 10. 55 years old patient underwent hysterectomy 2 years back. So there is history of lower abdominal or pelvic surgery 2 years back. Now patient presented with colicky abdominal pain and bilious vomiting. So there was history of surgery, and after 2 years patient is having colicky pain and bilious vomiting. It means this patient is having small bowel obstruction. On examination, abdomen was tender, exaggerated bowel sound. So obviously small bowel obstruction, the bowel sounds are exaggerated or hyperactive. On investigations, multiple air fluid levels were seen, suggestive of small bowel obstruction. What's the most probable diagnosis? So very easy question. Small bowel obstruction, there is history of previous surgery, and you know, because of surgery there is formation of adhesions, and the most common cause of small bowel obstruction is what? Adhesions. So what is the correct answer? It is adhesive small bowel obstruction. You know, in gastroenteritis there is no obstruction. It's not gallstone ileus because there is history of surgery and nothing is related to gallstone per se, not the ischemic enterocolitis. So correct answer is adhesive small bowel obstruction. See what's written in Bailey related to adhesions, that adhesions are strands of fibrous tissue that form because of surgery, and this is in between the surgically injured tissue. And overall, what is the most common cause of small bowel obstruction? Overall, the most common cause is adhesions. Now, in which kind of surgeries there is maximum risk of adhesive intestinal obstruction? So, there is maximum risk in gynecological operations or pelvic surgeries, followed by lower abdominal, followed by upper abdominal surgeries. So, maximum risk in pelvic surgeries or gynecological operations, followed by lower abdominal surgeries, followed by upper abdominal surgeries. Correct answer for this question is adhesive small bowel obstruction. See the question number 11. Another easy question. 25 years old patient presented with abdominal pain and distension. Abdominal pain and distension. Abdominal X-ray revealed the below image. Identify the prominent structures seen in the image. Now see, in this X-ray you can see that there are multiple dilated bowel loops, and these dilated bowel loops are placed centrally. So obviously this is small bowel obstruction or large bowel obstruction. So it's small bowel obstruction. What else you can see? These dilated bowel loops are placed centrally, narrow in caliber, and there is circumferential ring-like pattern which are equally spaced, and this circumferential ring-like pattern, it is known as what? Volvuli conniventis. This is volvuli conniventis, right? And you know this volvuli conniventis is the feature of which particular part of bowel? Jejunum. So if you see the options, transverse colon is obviously ruled out because patient is having small bowel obstruction, and out of ileum, jejunum, duodenum, what's the correct answer? Is the jejunum, because jejunum is having circumferentially ring-like pattern, equally spaced, that is volvuli conniventis. If you see ileum, ileum is featureless. Ileum is featureless, or it is said that it is characteristically characterless. Small bowel obstruction, large bowel obstruction, these are very, very important topics. Nowadays, frequently image-based questions are asked. What's the difference? We discussed that in small bowel obstruction, the dilated bowel loops are placed centrally, whereas in large bowel obstruction, it is placed peripherally. Large bowel obstruction, you can see these are wider in caliber, and you can see what? There is presence of horstrations. We are going for two views, supine view as well as erect view. You know that supine is better for site of obstruction, and you know erect is better for air fluid levels. So if you see this image here, also you can see that there is presence of circumferential ring-like pattern. Here you can see, so circumferential ring-like pattern. So again in this there is jejunum, involvement of jejunum. And see large bowel obstruction, you can easily mark what? Horstrations. You can see the colon, wider in caliber, location, it is placed peripherally. So this is how we differentiate small bowel from large bowel obstruction. And in this image you can see how volvuli conniventis looks like, circumferential ring-like pattern, equally spaced. So correct answer for this question is C, that's jejunum. See the question number 12. 45 years old male patient with paralysis. This patient is having paralysis, operated for rectal prolapse. So two important points. Patient is having rectal prolapse and patient is having paralysis. It means this patient cannot tolerate morbid surgery or long duration surgery. As shown in the image, which of the following procedure is done? So there is some procedure performed for rectal prolapse. Obviously this procedure will be having low morbidity. So here you can see around the anus some thread is being placed subcutaneously. Here you can see some thread is being placed subcutaneously, and these are the two threads which you can see here at the end. So generally, what is the name of this procedure? This is known as Thiersch anal wiring. When Thiersch performed this procedure, he used steel wire, but at this point of time we are using nylon or silastic tape. How it's done? Have a look. In this image you can see we are giving two incisions placed 180 degree apart. So two lateral incisions are given around the anus 180 degree apart, and after that we are performing the tunneling around the anus. Via this tunnel we are going to insert sometimes steel wire, silastic or nylon tape, and after inserting it, what it is being tied. So around this anal canal, application of silastic tape, nylon tape or steel wire, this is known as Thiersch anal wiring. So in this case you can see the wire is being used, and in this image you can see tape is being used. Okay, so how it works? This is the anus, this is the rectum. So what rectum is coming out? So patient is having rectal prolapse. So this is anal encirclement. And after that, what will happen? Obviously, this rectum will not come out. But what is the problem? Whenever you are applying wire or tape around the anus, it can lead to anal stenosis. It can lead to difficulty in defecation. And third, because of this procedure, surgical procedure, some patients are going to develop perianal abscess also, perianal sepsis also. Because of all these complications, this Thiersch procedure or Thiersch anal wiring is an obsolete procedure. So if you see the options, it is stapled hemorrhoidopexy. No, because patient is having rectal prolapse. So we have to go for rectopexy. All three are the types of rectopexy, but wires or tapes are used in Thiersch. So this is Thiersch wiring. What are the types of rectopexy done in adults? So there are two types of rectopexy. One is abdominal and the second is perineal. Abdominal and perineal. What is the advantage of abdominal rectopexy? Advantage that it is associated with lower risk of recurrence. What is the disadvantage? That there is increased morbidity of surgery. What is the advantage of perineal rectopexy? That there is lesser morbidity, but the disadvantage that there is high risk of recurrence. So which approach will be preferred in elderly patients? The patients who are having comorbidities, obviously in elderly or the patients who are having comorbidity, we go for perineal procedures. And if patient is young who can tolerate the surgery, we go for abdominal rectopexy. What are the types? Mnemonic is VAR and PAD. W means Wells, A means abdominal, R means Ripstein. So here you can see the procedures are Wells, abdominal, Ripstein. So Wells and Ripstein, these are the abdominal rectopexies, and here P means perineal, A means Altmeier's, D means Delorme. Delorme. So Altmeier's and Delorme's, these are the perineal rectopexies. Clear? So what is the correct answer for this question? The correct answer is Thiersch anal wiring or Thiersch wiring. See the important points related to Thiersch procedure in Shackelford. Shackelford is a Bible of GI surgery. So it says that we are going for two lateral perianal incisions 180 degrees apart. What is the position? Patient is in the prone jackknife or in lithotomy position. After that, the incisions are connected subcutaneously by tunneling through ischiorectal fossa and perineal body. And what we use? Polypropylene mesh, silicone tape or nylon tape, and it is tunneled circumferentially around the entire anus. Bailey says that in Thiersch operation or Thiersch anal wiring, steel wire, elastic or nylon tape placed around the anal canal. But what is the problem? Because of chronic perineal sepsis, it can lead to stenosis and it can lead to obstructed defecation. Because of all these problems, what? This surgery is largely obsolete. So we are not performing Thiersch procedure nowadays. See the question number 13. Another easy question. 54 years old male with right groin swelling located below inguinal ligament medial to the inferior epigastric artery. You know this basic principle that there is one hernia which is located lateral, this is right side, and one located medial. So obviously the medial hernias, these are direct hernias, and the laterals are indirect. right? So that's why indirect inguinal hernia is also known as lateral hernia because it is lateral to inferior epigastric artery. Direct inguinal hernias are also known as medial because it's medial to inferior epigastric artery. Cuff impulse was present. What is the type of hernia in its management? So diagnosis is clear that it is direct hernia because it is coming directly from posterior abdominal wall via triangle of Hazelbach. And what's the gold standard treatment for inguinal hernia repair? It is Lichtenstein repair. Bassini's repair is a tension repair. It increases the risk of recurrence. That's why it's not performed nowadays. So correct answer is what? Direct hernia, and the treatment is Lichtenstein repair. So correct answer for this question is B. See the important points related to anatomy. This is the triangle of Hazelbach, and via this triangle of Hazelbach, the direct hernia is coming into the inguinal canal. What are the boundaries? So here you can see medially the lateral border of rectus abdominis. Laterally you can see what? This inferior epigastric artery, and inferiorly there is inguinal ligament. And here you can see this is indirect inguinal hernia. Why indirect inguinal hernia is called indirect? Because it is coming indirectly in the inguinal canal via deep ring, then traverses the inguinal canal. So it is lateral to the inferior epigastric artery, and direct hernia it is medial. See the question number 14. A 30 years old female presented to hospital with what? Abdominal pain, weight loss, and sterile pyuria. You know, this sterile pyuria, it is seen in renal tuberculosis. Characteristic feature of renal tuberculosis. So you know the diagnosis. Radiograph is shown below. What is the most probable diagnosis? Suppose this image is not given below. So which of the following feature is characteristically seen in renal tuberculosis? And what's that? It's the putty kidney. Pyelonephritis, not the characteristic feature. These are not the characteristic features. So without image also, you can crack the question. If you see the image, what you can see here, scattered calcification involving the kidney, and this is known as what? Putty kidney. Now see the screenshot. This is from Surgery Sense. What's the problem in renal tuberculosis? Initially, there is stenosis of calyx or stenosis at pelviureteric junction, and whenever there is obstruction, what will happen? Obviously there will be hydronephrosis and pyonephrosis. Actually speaking, in tuberculosis there is caseous necrosis, and after that there is scattered calcification. So this caseous necrosis leading to scattered calcification, that is putty kidney, and after that kidney is completely calcified, and that is what? Cement kidney. And when kidney becomes non-functioning, calcified kidney becomes non-functioning, this procedure is known as, or this phenomena is known as what? Autonephrectomy, right? So what happens here? You can see there is collection of this kind of cheesy material in the kidney, and if you see the x-ray, this is the appearance. So this is what? Putty kidney, which is the characteristic feature of renal tuberculosis. So the correct answer for this question is A, that's putty kidney. See the question number 15. A patient of road traffic accident was brought to the hospital with left flank bruise. So where is the bruise? Left flank, associated with hematuria. So you tell me which organ is injured if there is ecchymosis or bruise in left flank and there is hematuria also. Obviously, it's a case of renal trauma. Renal trauma, right? Patient was hemodynamically stable. You know that the patients who are having renal injuries or renal trauma, what is the investigation of choice? The investigation of choice for diagnosis is CCT, and patient should be stable for CCT. So here patient is having renal trauma, patient is stable. So which of the following investigation should be done? We have to go for CCT. Generally in such cases we don't go for diagnostic peritoneal lavage, not RGU, not MCU. Why? Because there is renal trauma. Okay, see the screenshot from Surgery Sense. Kidney is the most commonly injured part of urinary tract, right? And what is the best indicator of traumatic urinary system injury? It is hematuria. And what is the investigation of choice for renal injury? The investigation of choice, it is CCT, but the patient should be stable. Sometimes the question is asked that what are the indications of performing CCT? So gross hematuria, microscopic hematuria with hypotension any time during initial resuscitation, right? But at the time when you're taking the patient for CCT, patient should be stable. See the literature also, what's written in subiston. In patients with history of blunt trauma, key findings include location of impact in renal injuries, flank ecchymosis, which is given, gross or microscopic hematuria, it's given, right? And what's written in Bailey related to diagnosis is the CT scan with contrast, means CCT, which is the investigation of choice, right? So what is the correct answer? Here it is CCT. It's a straightforward question. Patient underwent radical cystoprostatectomy, right? So we perform radical cystectomy or radical cystoprostatectomy in the conditions where the malignancy is in the bladder, and the specimen is given below. Identify the etiology. So in this specimen you can see this is the growth which is arising from the bladder and it's the malignancy. So what is the correct answer for this question? Obviously it is bladder cancer. What's the problem in schistosomiasis? In schistosomiasis, initially what happens? There is sandy patches. Later the bladder is calcified. Obviously prostate appears normal. Can you see here? So there is no malignancy and it's not the malakoplakia. So correct answer for this question is A. It's a clear-cut case of bladder cancer for which radical cystoprostatectomy was done. See the question number 17. What is the preferred treatment option for 85 years old patient, known case of prostate cancer, Gleason score 6 and 2 to 3 centimeter nodule in the prostate, level of PSA 8. So let me tell you, there is low risk prostate cancer. And what's that low risk prostate cancer? If the level of PSA is less than 10 nanogram per ml and level of Gleason score, if the Gleason score is less than equal to 6. Low risk prostate cancer, in these cases we have to go for only active surveillance. Second thing, the patients who are more than 70 years of age. In such patients, the life expectancy is less than 10 years. So any patient in whom the life expectancy is less than 10 years, radical prostatectomy is not done, right? So in such patients also, what we go for active surveillance. Clear? And what is the meaning of active surveillance? So every 6 monthly, the patients are coming to you and we are going to perform digital rectal examination plus PSA. So this active surveillance is done with the help of DRE and PSA. So here age 85, Gleason score 6, PSA 8, it means less than 10. So obviously we go for active surveillance. In which cases radical prostatectomy is done, the age should be less than 70 years and life expectancy more than 10 years. What's the role of brachytherapy or external beam radiotherapy? These are the methods of palliation. So methods of palliation, palliative radiotherapy can be used. We use brachytherapy also, EBRT also. But for this patient, this is not the preferred option. Correct answer is C. See the management of prostate cancer. So if T1A is there, it means it is incidentally detected during TURP. What? Nothing. Only DRE plus PSA. And if T1B, T1C, T2 and the age is more than 70 years, where the life expectancy is less than 10 years, again what? Watchful waiting means active surveillance with DRE and PSA. If age is less than 70 years, then only we go for radical prostatectomy or we can go for radiotherapy. Preferred option is radical prostatectomy. And the patients who are having advanced carcinoma prostate or there is metastasis, in these cases palliative treatment, either androgen ablation, which is the part of hormone therapy, or we go for palliative radiotherapy. You know that there are 2 new drugs in metastatic castration resistant carcinoma prostate. One is cabazitaxel and second is sipuleucel T, which are used. See what Bailey says related to CA prostate. Men with locally confined prostate cancer have PSA level 10 to 15 nanogram per ml, less than 10 to 15. And what is the definition of low risk prostate cancer? Low PSA, small foci of Gleason 6 disease. And how we can manage active surveillance, that is DRE plus PSA. Radical prostatectomy is done in which patients? Localized disease. And what should be the life expectancy? More than 10 years. So if you see the question again, correct answer for this question is C, that is active surveillance. Another repeat question, because similar question was asked in INI-CET. See, a 10 years old boy skids while cycling. So what happens? There is cycle handle. Skids while cycling. Child was stable. Abdominal examinations were normal. But what's the problem? There was blood at the tip of meatus. What's the next best step? What's the next best step? So what is the diagnosis? There is skidding. And because of that, what's the problem? So what's the problem in such patients? Can you see, because of skidding, what happens? There is injury. So this bulbar urethra is crushed against the pubic symphysis. So there is anterior urethral injury, and the most commonly injured part of urethra, that's bulbar. And after this injury, what is the problem? You can see, because of this injury, there is collection of blood involving bilateral scrotum, shaft of penis, perineum. So there is perineal hematoma. What's the problem? There is urinary retention. And what's the problem? There is blood at meatus. So urinary retention, blood at meatus, perineal hematoma, it is seen in anterior urethral injury, and the most common site is bulbar. In these patients, what is the treatment? So such patients are treated by SPC. We have to perform suprapubic cystostomy. And because of injury, what will happen? There will be formation of stricture. It will be repaired after 3 months. So there is delayed repair if patient is having symptomatic stricture. But in emergency, we go for suprapubic cystostomy. Obviously, nephrostomy is not done. Ureteric diversion is not done. Foley's catheterization, generally it should not be done, because if you are going to attempt Foley's catheterization, sometimes the partial tear can be converted into complete. So what's the correct answer for this question? B, suprapubic cystostomy. Now see the literature, what's written in Smith Urology and Bailey related to rupture of this bulbar urethra, cycling accidents. You have seen loose manhole covers or gymnasium accidents astride the beam. These are responsible for what? Bulbar urethra injury. If you see, in such patient, no attempt should be made to pass a urethral catheter. And whenever these patients have distended bladder, we have to go for SPC. We have to ask the patient, that patient should not allowed to void until assessment of urethra is complete. Sometimes we perform one investigation also, and if you want to perform one investigation, you can go for RGU. So we can perform retrograde urethrogram to see the site of injury. So if this is there, you can go for RGU. And since RGU is not there in the option, what is the correct answer for this question? It is B, that is suprapubic cystostomy. See the question number 19, again a repeat question. 26 years old male was operated for redness over perineal area. Post day 5 images given below. Which of the following statement is correct about this condition? So what's the problem here? This patient was having this kind of problem. What? There was some problem in perineal area in which excision of perineal skin was done. So obviously this patient developed necrotizing fasciitis of perineum. Following that, those necroskin was excised. And this is what? Fournier's gangrene. It's a classical case of Fournier's gangrene in which there is obliterative endarteritis. Because of that, there is necrosis of perineal skin. Now the name is necrotizing fasciitis. It means which structures are involved. So structures till fascia are involved, like skin, subcutaneous tissue, and fascia. So structure, superficial fascia, deep fascia. So structures are involved till fascia. What are the structures which are spared in perineal region? So carpora cavernosa, carpora spongiosa, which contains urethra, testis is spared, cord structures are spared. So here you can see exposed testes after debridement of perineal necrosed area. So this is Fournier's gangrene. You know that the Fournier's gangrene is polymicrobial infection and it is caused by both aerobes as well as anaerobes. Simple. So see the options. Which of the following statement is correct about this condition? It is caused by mixed aerobic and aerobic infection. Correct. Urinary diversion is required. Usually urinary diversion and fecal diversion is not required. Usually it's done rarely. Bilateral orchidectomy should not be done. Should be done. It should not be done because cord structures, testes, these are spared. These are not involved. Anti-gas gangrene serum should be considered. No, anti-gas gangrene serum is given in gas gangrene, not in necrotizing fasciitis. So this is also incorrect. What is the correct answer for this question? It's A. See the literature. Fournier's gangrene is a polymicrobial infection. And what are the areas which are involved? Perineum, external genitalia and perianal region. And it is a type of necrotizing fasciitis, right? So it's the mixed infection of both aerobic and anaerobic bacteria. What's the treatment? So first, patient is having sepsis, so we have to give IV fluids, we have to resuscitate the patient, we have to give IV antibiotics. After resuscitation, in all cases, we have to go for surgical debridement. So urgent wide surgical excision is done. Urinary and fecal diversion may be necessary, but it is done only rarely. So correct answer for this question, that's A. It is caused by mixed aerobe and anaerobe infection. See the question number 20. A 35 years old HIV positive female on ART had a severe migraine headache and for which she was given multiple doses of ergotamine. When? 2 days back. Now the problem is she presented with claudication of which part? Right thigh. So claudication is there in the right thigh with some numbness and tingling where? In the right lower limb. But the peripheral pulses were feeble, means still palpable but feeble. Angiography image is given below. What will be the next step of management? So here the problem is that patient is having claudication, tingling, numbness in the right lower limb and that claudication is in the thigh. It means obstruction is just above that level. So in the right iliac, either obstruction is in the common iliac or it's in the external iliac. What is the problem here? There is tingling, numbness, peripheral pulses were feeble. It means this patient is having critical limb ischemia. Doesn't matter this angiography image is given or not. If the patient is having critical limb ischemia, urgent intervention should be performed to save the ischemic limb. Otherwise, what will happen? There will be gangrene. It can lead to gangrene. So in these cases, whenever there is critical limb ischemia, we have to go for urgent intervention and preferred intervention will be percutaneous transluminal angioplasty with stenting. In this emergency scenario, we should not go for what? Any kind of bypass. So bypass is not done. Here what's done? We have to go for percutaneous transluminal angioplasty with stenting. If you see this angiography, where is the obstruction? If you see the angiography, obstruction is at the level of common iliac artery. See the bigger picture. First, have a look of normal angiography. So here you can make out this is abdominal aorta. This is the bifurcation. This is internal iliac. This is common iliac and this is external iliac. See the angiography image which is given in the question. This is aorta. This is the bifurcation and this is the common iliac. So in the right common iliac artery, what happens? There is occlusion. So here we go for PTA with stenting because it's an intervention which is performed easily and it's going to save the limb. In which cases we go for bypass? Imagine if PTA is failed or it's not available. So if stenting facility is failed, it's not available, only in those cases we go for bypass. And if obstruction is here, then we can go for aorto-iliac bypass We can go for aortofemoral bypass. In certain patients, axillofemoral bypass can also be done. But in this particular scenario, what is the correct answer? We go for percutaneous transluminal angioplasty with stenting. Now see the literature related to stenting. Percutaneous transluminal angioplasty has proved very successful in dilating the iliac and femoropopliteal segments. But what is the problem? Whenever the obstruction is below knee, if you perform the stenting because of wear and tear, it is not that successful, right? So in which cases we have to go for surgical operations? Surgical operations are usually reserved for the patient with severe symptoms where angioplasty has failed or it's not possible. And whenever we are going for any kind of bypass from aorta, synthetic grafts are used, and that's Dacron graft. In certain patients or the patients who are not fit for aortoiliac bypass or aortofemoral bypass, in unfit patients, we can go for axillofemoral bypass. But these are alternatives. What is the preferred treatment? It's PTA with stenting. If you see the question again, this patient is having signs and symptoms of critical limb ischemia involving common iliac artery, and we have to go for percutaneous transluminal angioplasty with stenting. This is another indirect repeat because lots of questions were asked about CEAP classification. If you see the question, 45 years old male presents to the hospital with asymptomatic varicose vein. Can you see here? So this patient is having asymptomatic varicose vein. Which CEAP classification does the patient fall under? So what is the meaning of this CEAP classification? CEAP classification is used for chronic lower extremity venous disease. And what is the meaning? C means clinical signs and symptoms. If patient is asymptomatic, we have to use A, and if patient is symptomatic, we have to use S. E means etiological classification. What do you mean by etiological classification? Whether this is congenital, whether it's primary, whether it is secondary. A means anatomical distribution, means which system is involved, whether there is involvement of superficial system, deep system, perforators, or combination is involved. And P means pathophysiological dysfunction. So what is the pathophysiology? Whether patient is having reflux, obstruction, only reflux, only obstruction, or in the combination. So this is CEAP classification. Majority of questions are asked about this C. So what are the various types of C? So C is further divided into C0 to C6. And if patient will be asymptomatic, we are using A. And if patient will be symptomatic, we are using S. It is supplemented by A or S. What do you mean by C0? Whenever there is no visible or palpable sign of varicosity. C1, if the patient is having any kind of telangiectasia, or if patient is having reticular vein, we use C1. If patient is having varicose vein, we are using C2. Patient is asymptomatic, it becomes C2A. And if patient is symptomatic, it becomes C2S. Whenever patients are going to develop edema also, then it is C3. C4 is further divided into C4A and C4B. So what is included in C4A? Whenever there is pigmentation or there is eczema. And if the patient is having lipodermatosclerosis with or without atrophy, that's C4B. And this was the question in the latest exam. C4B, there is lipodermatosclerosis with or without white atrophy. Whenever there is healed wound, it is C5. And if the wound is open, means if there is ulceration and there is open wound, it is C6. Right? So see the question again. This patient is having varicose vein. So obviously we are using C2. And since patient is asymptomatic, so this is what? C2A. So what is the correct answer for this question? The correct answer for this question is A. See the question number 22. 64 years old male patient underwent coronary artery bypass grafting, for which graft was taken from great saphenous vein. So great saphenous vein was harvested, and obviously from where we are going to harvest it? From the lower limb, especially between the ankle and what? Knee joint. Now see, the patient is now complaining of lack of sensation over medial aspect of leg, foot associated with heel pain. So there is loss of sensation over medial aspect of leg, foot. Simultaneously, there is heel pain. What is the most likely nerve affected in this scenario? Similar question were asked in the past also, that whenever venous cut down was done in great saphenous vein, one nerve was injured leading to paresthesia in the medial aspect of lower limb or foot. Which nerve is most commonly injured? So before discussing this question, you should understand anatomy. Here you can see this is saphenous nerve and this is great saphenous vein. So if you see the relation of saphenous nerve with great saphenous vein, it runs close to great saphenous vein in the calf as compared to thigh. As compared to thigh, there is close relation of saphenous nerve with great saphenous vein. And that's why in patients of varicose vein, whenever we are going for stripping, the stripping is done till the knee joint. If you are planning to do the stripping below knee joint, there is high risk of injury of which nerve? Obviously, saphenous nerve. So whenever this nerve is being harvested for CABG, coronary artery bypass grafting, obviously which nerve is most commonly injured? It is saphenous nerve, and because of that, patient is going to develop paresthesia over the medial aspect of lower limb, especially leg and foot. Now see the relation of sural nerve. If you see the sural nerve here, yes, below mid calf, there is close relation of this sural nerve with short saphenous vein. So with short saphenous, you can see there is close relation of sural nerve, especially below the mid calf. So patients who are having varicose vein involving short saphenous system, and we want to perform the stripping of short saphenous vein, what should be the level? Generally, it should be done till mid calf. Till mid calf. So what are the one-liner questions which are asked? Most commonly injured nerve during stripping of great saphenous vein, saphenous nerve. Most commonly injured nerve during stripping of short saphenous vein, sural nerve. So if you see the question, most likely nerve affected in this scenario would be saphenous nerve. So correct answer for this question is A. See the literature, what's written in Subiston related to saphenous nerve injury. The saphenous nerve injury is a well-documented complication, and when it is going to occur? When saphenous vein, great saphenous vein is stripped from ankle to groin. Why? Because saphenous nerve runs close to great saphenous vein in the calf as compared with thigh. And whenever we are going to strip the small saphenous vein, it should be done only to the level of mid calf. Why? To prevent the injury of sural nerve. So here for CABG, great saphenous vein is being used. So most commonly injured nerve is what? Saphenous nerve. Again, this is an indirect repeat. See the question. 80 years old female presented with fatigue and pallor. On chest x-ray, there was anterior mediastinal mass. You tell me what is the most common anterior mediastinal mass, and the most common anterior mediastinal mass is thymoma. Okay. Second thing, this patient was diagnosed with pure red cell aplasia. Important point related to thymoma, that the most common paraneoplastic syndrome associated with thymoma, it is myasthenia gravis. Right? Apart from myasthenia gravis, it is also associated with what? Hypogammaglobulinemia. It is associated with pure red cell aplasia. So, thymoma is associated with pure red cell aplasia. So, the tumor is in anterior mediastinum associated with pure red cell aplasia. And what is the correct answer? Thymic neoplasia or thymoma. See the literature, what's written in Subiston, that thymomas are the most common neoplasm of anterosuperior or anterior compartment of mediastinum or anterior mediastinum. And what is the most common paraneoplastic syndrome associated with thymoma we discussed? It's myasthenia. Apart from that, there can be pure red cell aplasia, hypogammaglobulinemia, and thymoma associated multi-organ autoimmunity. Clear? So it's a clear-cut question. Correct answer for this question is A, thymic neoplasia. Before discussing this question, see, whenever there is foreign body ingestion and the coin is there, right, what happens whenever this coin is in the esophagus and we are taking AP view, X-ray AP view, generally you can see the flat surface of coin. So this is the flat surface, and whenever you are taking lateral view, you can see the edge. So in esophagus, when the foreign body is there, on AP view you can see flat surface, on lateral view you can see edge, and vice versa in trachea. It means whenever it is in the trachea, on AP view you can see the edge, and on lateral view you can see the flat surface. This is foreign body in the esophagus, and you can see this is the flat surface in AP view, means the coin is aligned in coronal plane. On AP view or antero-posteriorly, the coin is aligned in the coronal plane, and in trachea, whenever the coin is there and in AP view, it is aligned in sagittal plane. This you have to remember. Frequently asked question, right? How it looks on X-ray. So first see, whenever it is in esophagus, this is the AP view. You can see the flat surface or alignment in coronal plane, and here you can see the edge in the lateral view, right? See, when the coin is in the trachea and you perform AP view, here you can see the edge, and on lateral view, here this is flat surface, right? So easily you are going to make out whether the foreign body or the coin is in the trachea or esophagus. One. Second, you can make out on the basis of symptoms also. If a patient is having dysphagia, it means the coin is in the esophagus. If patient is having dyspnea or respiratory distress, it means the coin is in the trachea. Another important point, whenever we are going for lateral view, you can see anteriorly there is shadow, air shadow in the trachea. So on the lateral view, if you can see air shadow in the trachea, it means obviously the coin is located posterior to trachea, in which organ? Esophagus. Clear? So see the question. 9 years old male child was brought to the emergency by mother with difficulty in swallowing. What's the problem? There is difficulty in swallowing for the past 5 hours. He was noted to play unsupervised. X-ray was taken, identify the location. So you can see the coin in the coronal plane on AP view, or you can see the flat surface of the coin on AP view. So obviously it's in the esophagus. So what is the correct answer for this question? A, esophagus. See what's written in Nielsen related to foreign bodies. The flat surface of coin in the esophagus. Which surface? Flat surface of the coin in the esophagus is seen on the AP view and edge on the lateral view, vice versa in the trachea. So here you can see flat surface, edge, foreign body is in the esophagus, and how to make out on lateral surface? You can see that there is gas shadow in the trachea located anteriorly to the coin. So for this question, correct answer is A, and that is esophagus. See the question number 25. Again a repeat question. On removal of submandibular gland and its duct, which of the following nerve is most commonly injured? You know there is close relation of two nerves with submandibular gland and its duct. Lingual nerve is going to hook the duct of submandibular gland. So whenever we are performing the duct surgery, specially, most commonly injured nerve is lingual nerve. So in these surgeries, most commonly injured nerve is lingual, followed by hypoglossal. Okay, see the anatomical relationship. So in this diagram, you can see this is the submandibular duct, and this submandibular duct, it's hooked by this nerve. This is which one? Lingual nerve. And in relation to submandibular gland, there is another nerve which is closely related, hypoglossal. So most commonly injured nerve in submandibular gland surgery with removal of its duct. Lingual followed by hypoglossal. So what's the correct answer for this question? The correct answer is A. See question number 26. A 56 years old man was working in a benzene factory for a long time. He got retired 5 years back. What would be the possible complication in this patient? You tell me. History of working in the benzene factory. It's a risk factor for which malignancy? Acute myelocytic leukemia. It's a risk factor for acute myelocytic leukemia. So what is the correct answer? Obviously blood cancer. So the correct answer for this question is B. This list of carcinogens is very important, and here you can see whenever there is history of work in benzene factory, it is going to increase the risk of acute myelocytic leukemia, right? So this list is very important. Almost every year you are getting one question directly or indirectly related to this list of carcinogens. So if there is history of work in benzene factory, it leads to increased risk of AML. So correct answer for this question is B, that's blood cancer. Similar question was asked in INI CET also. Recently, a child undergoes prophylactic irradiation as a preparation for bone marrow transplant for treatment of ALL. Which of the following is affected least? Means which of the following organ is least affected after radiotherapy? So see the sensitivity of radiotherapy. Which organ is affected most? Mnemonic is BML to intestinal mucosa. Mnemonic is BML to intestinal mucosa. So most sensitive is bone marrow, followed by lymphatic tissues. So BML, followed by T and O means testis and ovary, followed by intestinal mucosa. So BML to intestinal mucosa, this is the sensitivity. Bone marrow, followed by lymphatics, followed by testis and ovary, followed by intestinal mucosa. Which one is most resistant? And that is nervous tissue or brain. Is the nervous tissue or brain? So what is the correct answer? Least affected, obviously it's the neurons. Otherwise bone marrow, intestinal epithelial cells, spermatogonia, all of these are highly sensitive. So see, the dividing cells are highly sensitive, and if in the cells or tissues where no division is occurring, those are resistant. So if there is active cell division, there is high sensitivity, and if there is no cell division, there is low sensitivity. So what is most resistant? Nervous tissue or brain? And which one is most sensitive? Bone marrow, followed by lymphatic tissue means spleen, thymus, lymph node, followed by reproductive system like testis, ovary, followed by GIT, especially the mucous membrane and small intestinal villi or mucosa. So correct answer here is the neuron. See the important one-liner questions related to radiotherapy. What is the most radio-sensitive tissue in the body? We discussed it is bone marrow, and most resistant, that is brain or nervous tissue. Most radiosensitive blood cell, in lymphomas we give radiotherapy, lymphocyte, and least radiosensitive, it is platelets. Now see, what is the organ, most common organ to be affected by radiation? It is the skin. And what is the earliest change in the skin we are going to see? It is erythema, right? Most radio resistant organ overall, if you see, most radio resistant tissue, that's nervous tissue or brain, and most radio resistant organ, that is vagina. Most common mucosa to be affected by radiation, we discussed intestinal mucosa, and whenever it is involved or affected, obviously patient is having diarrhea. And in abdomen, what is the most sensitive organ? It is kidney. So these are important one-liner questions related to radiotherapy. See the question number 28. What is the maneuver shown below? So here you can see that head is being tilted back and chin lift is being done. So what is the name of this maneuver? This is head tilt and chin lift. Why we perform this head tilt and chin lift? To prevent the tongue obstructing the upper airway. So to prevent the obstruction of upper airway by tongue, we perform what? Head tilt and chin lift. Second maneuver is jaw thrust. So in this jaw thrust, the tongue is moved anteriorly along with mandible to prevent the obstruction of upper airway. So this is jaw thrust and this is what? Head tilt chin lift. So correct answer for this question is B. It is head tilt chin lift to prevent the obstruction of upper airway from the tongue. Another question which is asked every year in each and every paper, and that is the question related to tension pneumothorax. Sometimes they ask the question related to diagnosis, and most of the times they are asking the question related to management. See, 25 years old male patient presented to emergency with history of road traffic accident. On examination, patient had subcutaneous emphysema, absence of air entry on the right side, and hypotension. So on the right side, subcutaneous emphysema, absence of air entry, and hypotension. It means there is collection of what? Either air or the fluid. Which of the following will be the next step of management? Okay. Now see, in these cases, whenever there is subcutaneous emphysema also, generally it is because of what? Injury to the chest wall and there is pneumothorax, right? It can progress to tension pneumothorax. Since patient is having hypotension also, most probably it's a case of tension pneumothorax. How to manage? So any patient of trauma, we have to apply A, B, C, D, E. Which protocol? A, B, C, D, E. A means airway maintenance. So this patient is having maintained airway. Why? Because in the question it is mentioned that air entry was absent only on the right side. It means air entry was there on the left side. Means airway is patent. Second, whether we have to go for intubation or not. So intubation is done when the patient is having airway obstruction or there is mental status depression, or patients who are having noisy breathing, patients who are having facial trauma, or patients whose GCS is less than 8. So it's not mentioned whether patient is having noisy breathing, patient is having facial trauma, GCS is lesser, mental status depression is there. It means all these things are not there, right? Airway is patent. So obviously we are not supposed to go for intubation. Now coming for B. B means breathing, which includes oxygenation and ventilation, right? Here we have to look for any problem associated with oxygenation and ventilation. In patients of tension pneumothorax, what's the problem? There is ventilation problem. See, in patients of tension pneumothorax, there is formation of one-way air valve. So it's one-way valve leak. Because of that, the air is forced into thoracic cavity. And when air is collected under tension, first it is going to compress the ipsilateral lung. After that, there is depression of diaphragm, shift of mediastinum. Simultaneously, it compresses superior vena cava as well as inferior vena cava whenever air is collected under tension. So because of compression of superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, there is decreased venous return and these patients have hypotension. These patients have hypotension. Air is collected. If you perform percussion, what happens? There is hyperresonance. If you perform auscultation, there is absent breath sounds. So it's an emergency situation. In such cases, we have to put a wide bore needle in 5th intercostal space in anterior axillary line in adults according to ATLS 2018 modification. And in children, wide bore needle should be inserted in 2nd intercostal space in midclavicular line, right? So what is the age of patient? 25 years old. So adult patient, put a wide bore needle into 5th intercostal space in anterior axillary line. So what is the correct answer? It's A. Fluid resuscitation with wide bore needle. It's the next step. C. C means circulation with hemorrhage control. So here we are giving IV fluid. We are going to manage the patients of shock. Positive pressure ventilation not recommended in these patients. So this is the next step. After putting a needle, we plan for ICD insertion, means intercostal drain insertion, again in the triangle of safety in 5th intercostal space in anterior axillary line, right? So sequence is A, B, C, D, E. Airway is patent. There is ventilation problem. So we have to correct that. It's immediately life-threatening situation. So what should be done? Needle decompression in fifth intercostal space in anterior axillary line according to ATLS 2018 update. See the question number 30. 25 years old male patient with alleged history of road traffic accident sustained injury over chest and abdomen. So there is injury over chest and abdomen. At the time of presentation, systolic BP 70 mmHg, pulse rate more than 110 or 110. Now let me tell you, what is the meaning of unstable vitals? Unstable vitals means whenever the pulse rate is more than 100 per minute and the systolic blood pressure is less than 100 mmHg. So this patient is unstable, patient of trauma, having injury of the abdomen and the chest. What is the first investigation done in patients of blunt trauma abdomen? It is FAST. Doesn't matter patient is stable or unstable. So first investigation is FAST because it can be done bedside. And whenever FAST is extended to assess right and left thoracic view, it is known as EFAST, that is extended FAST. Clear? So we go for CT? No. We go for MRI? No. We go for chest X-ray? No. Not bedside investigation. Unstable patient, we go for FAST. And actually speaking, it is EFAST. What is the full form of FAST? It is the focused assessment with sonography for trauma. What we assess? We are going to assess 4 P's. 4 P's means pericardium, perihepatic, perisplenic and pelvic region. In which sequence? In this sequence. Clear? So there are 4 views in FAST. Whenever we are including right as well as left thoracic view, total 6 views in EFAST. And you must be knowing that question which is frequently asked nowadays. Whenever patient is having pneumothorax, you perform EFAST. There is barcode sign also known as stratosphere sign. So patient is having injury to both abdomen and chest, we go for EFAST. So correct answer for this question is A, that is FAST. See the question number 31, again a repeat question. In emergency with trauma patient, blood spilled on the floor. Which of the following agent should be used for sterilization? And whenever there is spillage of blood, you must be knowing that we use sodium hypochlorite. What we use? Sodium hypochlorite. So these were the surgery questions in NEET PG 2021. So see, total 31 questions, including both direct and indirect questions related to surgery, were asked in NEET PG 2021. And all these questions were from our video lectures, all from the book Surgery Sense. What was the strike rate of Rapid Revision 3.0? 90% of surgery questions were asked from Rapid Revision 3.0. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Thank you very much.